this video, I'd like to discuss how I think that World War II was more or less the death knell for Western philosophy as a intellectually honest and varied heterodox pursuit. Basically, the scarring that World War II left on Europe in particular more or less stifled intellectual creativity that we experienced leading up to it. A lot of the times you would get atypical and fringe views circulated within the intelligentsia and the wider bourgeois circles perhaps, whereas now it's very monodominant and there's more or less a fixed way of understanding a lot of these issues, and that they're more steeped in a tradition or a school rather than stemming from anywhere or anyone else or anywhere else than a very certain sect of people. So obviously when you have this lack of diversity in thought, you have a very poor outcome in terms of innovation and I would say the general health and vitality of a school or even of a topic, of a sphere. This has more or less allowed us to operate under a fixed mode of conduct when it comes to both the expression of civil society, and in that I mean the collection of egos expressing themselves in a more general manner has been very, very undiverse and singular, in that even with the combative nature of capitalism versus communism during the Cold War, they were still very, very distinct and similar in the way that they chose to govern and manage and express the collective identities of all these citizens. And so when you have these unidimensional and monolithic ideologies, you retain only those ideas which could prosper in such a sphere, in such an environment that is conducive to their existence. So you don't actually allow the prosper of good ideas which don't conform to the societal expectations set by such a unidimensional and strict adherence to certain guidelines or laws or philosophical impositions. Further to this, I think we are at a place where we are unable to, well, we're irrevocably damaged to the point where we're no longer salvageable. So Western civilization is obviously in decline, whether or not you agree with that economically or technology-wise. It definitely is culturally, and I think this could be more or less assigned to World War II was the pivotal point between which kind of direction after the Allies took victory we were going to go, whether it was going to be a free and thoughtful society rather than a antagonistic and oppressive society. And obviously we chose the oppressive one because we need certain ideologies to be true and to reign supreme for our own, well, for the assured safety of the citizens rather than perhaps the prosper of ideas just for the sake of themselves, which we more or less got through the 17 and 1800s. The decentralization of ideas is much more important, I think, in a more long-term sustainable view than the what you would call the conglomeration of ideas into a certain societal expectation. So these indelible scars, which are wrought throughout the psyche of almost every Occidental mind, is the unexercisable tumour which is currently eating away at the capacity for independent thought. And no longer is it necessary to even properly understand politicians and their dispositions and their policies, because we all know even the most radical will still play and fall within bounds which are set and certain, and that laws are now tending to dictate to what can be and cannot be said, and therefore even countries with free expression still have the compulsion for a adherence to certain social expectations. So with this, it unfortunately means that our cultural diversity, which is the way that nature does it, is it has a diverse population with mutations allowing for the capacity to deal with exogenous threats, which may necessarily kill off a lot of the population, but allow some to survive because their mutations in themselves have allowed them to deal with the tumultuous and scarring and threatening winds. Now, obviously, these winds have changed the same way that diseases work. When we're not inoculated with any other genes, then we tend to be able to succumb to these wounds terminally, which is basically more or less the point we are at culturally, and I'll be offering some more proof and evidence of this sort of mindset, but it's obviously not a new thought process, but this is kind of elucidating to you as to where I think the source of the real beginning of the end has come about.